Chapter 3, Principles of Design. This chapter is going to deal with how we construct composition. So, how we deal with things like space, how we think about figures and grounds and their placement, and so forth. So, the first question is, what can design do and for what is it used? And I'd say that design really within art is its visual language. So if you want to speak about art, you have to know this language. It is the foundation for all of art, and it applies to all the mediums that we're going to be discussing. So again, it's very fundamental to understand the design elements. Last time we talked about primary elements, things like color, texture. Now we're going to think about how those elements can be designed within a composition. The first thing we'll talk about is how to design space. And this is just a basic discussion of what we call the picture plane, which is sort of step one, I'd say, of understanding the designing of space. You'll notice that there's negative space and positive space. And how I often explain this to students is, how do you activate a negative space? You place objects upon it. So you take negative space, you activate it and make it positive by the placement of the objects. And I gave you here two different examples. One that is what I'd say a very sort of straightforward figural painting. I'm sure you can recognize the subjects in it. To be very specific, this is Gentileschi's Judith and Holofernes from the Italian Baroque period. But I could have used pretty much any type of figural painting. And then on the other side, you have Ellsworth Kelly's piece that is more non-representational. So what I wanted to do is contrast, in a sense, a more traditional figural piece with a more non-traditional, non-representational piece. So you'll notice that, you also can think about how figures are placed on grounds, right? The ground is literally the background. If you think about it, where does background come from as a word? This is how we think about it artistically. And you'll notice that the figure is placed upon it. So again, you can look from side to side and think about figure and ground and negative and positive space using both of the images. And it's not always easy. Sometimes you deal with artists who deal with figure ground reversal. As you see here with this M.C. Escher piece, he's known for his illusionistic pieces, tricking the eye, fooling the eye. And here you'll see how he uses the word metamorphosis. So he's using a language pun within a visual pun, and he's kind of flipping the imagery back and forth to the point where you really can't figure out which is the figure and which is the ground, because he's converting your eye through this exercise. And then there's imagery, of course, that has figure ground ambiguity, like a yin and a yang symbol. The yin-yang symbol is from Chinese culture, and it really is an expression of their belief in balance and duality, and that within the universe there's always going to be light and there's always going to be dark. But they believe very strongly that within the dark there's always light, and within the light there's always dark. You can't be purely one element or the other. And so here you'll notice which is the figure, which is the ground, which is the positive, which is the negative. It definitely has figure ground ambiguity due to that little dot right inside the other ground. So it leads us to say we're not really sure. There is ambiguity to the conversation. How do we construct space? We've spoken a little bit about all this before. We've talked a bit about one-point perspective, for instance. But I'd say that, when you think about early artworks, this is a very, very early piece from from prehistory. And it deals with the eruption of the Çatalhöyük volcano. So you'll see the volcano here, right? And it's shown from two different, what we call perspectives. Perspective, when we say, I see something from your perspective, or I don't see something from your perspective, right? It's a way of seeing, if we want to categorize it that way. This has two different perspectives. We're seeing the volcano straight on, and we're seeing the city, that's what it is, it's a city, from above. So we're having aerial or bird's eye viewpoint, and then a more traditional straight on viewpoint of the volcano. Early artists dealt with this idea of, combining perspectives very often. But then, of course, as we talked about, we move to a more naturalistic view of space right around the Renaissance with, of course, linear one-point perspective. I've explained this before. You saw Berti's diagram, so I'm not going to belabor that point. But here with Raphael's School of Athens, hopefully you can see it again. There's the one-point diagram tracing itself to Plato and Aristotle in the middle. Again, go back and think about how the architecture leads you to the basically the vanishing point area, which is here, right? So again, we spoke a little bit about the idea of perspective. Now, we did not talk about atmospheric perspective, and that's what you see in Masaccio's piece of the tribute money. Atmospheric perspective, you'll notice there's no linear perspective here. There's no lines. There's no depth in that way. But what it does is usually it's almost like slices of space, background, middle ground, foreground, right? Front, fore, middle, back. And what they'll do with the background is they'll blur the background. Because if you go outside right now and look off into the distance, you'll notice that the further things are away, the blurrier they are. So what atmospheric perspective does is create depth of space through the blurring of the background, and it creates a realistic depth of space within the piece.